Good afternoon. I'm Juliane Canfield, the director of Deutsches Haus at NYU, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second Irregular Readings event, a conversation about Sharon Dodua Otoo's new novel, Adas Raum, or Adas Raum. We're super thrilled to co-present this event together with the NYU Center for the Humanities and Stanford University's Division of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And I might have messed up the order. I can never remember of the nouns in that term. This is a series Deutsches Haus organizes and presents together with these two organizations. And I want to give a big shout out to my co-organizers, Amir Eshel, Ulrich Baer, and Sarah Girna. It's a pleasure to work with you. And of course, we're immensely excited and grateful that Sharon Dodua Otoo and her translator, her English translator, Jon Cho-Polizzi, are here with us today to be in conversation with Uli and Amir and discuss Sharon's intriguing new novel that is already out in Germany by Fischer Verlag and is coming out, I think Sharon said later next year or early in 2023 in English translation. So for those of you who don't speak German yet, bear with us and we will have a reading in German, but immediately followed by the excerpt in English, and then you can look forward to John's I'm sure fabulous translation of Sharon's new novel. So I want to thank the speakers, the co-organizers. I want to thank the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their support of our academically inclined events. I also want to thank my direct colleagues, Sarah, Sasha, and Tina for their support. And of course, you, the audience, for making time on a Friday afternoon or evening, wherever you are, to join us and to learn more about this fabulous book. And just about a year ago, we actually had an event with Sharon regarding her Herr Grottrop setzt sich hin text. Herr Grottrop sits down, or I think the English language, the English translation where Herr Grottrop takes a seat. And so in a way, we're now talking as a sequel to that event. And of course, there are Erzählstränge or positions perhaps that are a bit of a continuation from Sharon's Herr Grottrop setzt sich hin, as we will see. And I'm really curious to see about the connection between these two texts. But of course, there's so much more to Adas Raum or Adas Raum, which we will find out shortly. But before that, I want to read you a little bit of biographical information about our speakers. My colleague Sarah will post their more detailed biographical information in the chat, so you can read that. We will also have a link for the novel itself in the chat, so you can click on that and order it or find out more. So I will start by introducing Sharon, and just in terms of the Ablauf, we will, after the introductions, Sharon will read an excerpt from her novel, and then Jon Cho-Polizzi will read his translation, and then Amir and Uli will jump into the conversation. And this is a very informal conversation, and you, in the meantime, have the chance to ask your questions in writing by submitting them via the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Okay, here we go. Sharon Dodua Otoo is an author and political activist. She writes prose and essays and is editor of the English language book series Witnessed. Hi, Sharon. Thanks for joining. In 2017, her first novellas, The Things I'm Thinking While Smiling Politely and Synchronicity, were republished in German translation by Fischer Verlag. Otoo won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2016 with her text Herr Grottrop setzt sich hin. In 2020, her inaugural speech at the Festival of German Language Literature, Dürfen Schwarze Blumen malen, was published by Verlag Heim. Adas Raum, her first novel in German, appeared this year obviously, with Fischer Verlag. Otoo is politically active with the Initiative Schwarze Menschen in Deutschland e.V. and Phoenix e.V. Thanks for being here today, Sharon. Jon Cho-Polizzi is an educator and freelance literary translator. He studied literature, history, hi Jon, and translation studies in Santa Cruz and Heidelberg before receiving his PhD in German and medieval studies at UC Berkeley. Jon was managing editor for Berkeley's Transit Journal, and is currently guest editing a second special issue of the journal with English translations from the 2019 collection Eure Heimat ist unser Albtraum, and I highly recommend that. It's a fabulous collection you should read. In addition to his forthcoming translation of Adas Raum, Jon's translations have appeared in many renowned publications and in numerous anthologies. Moving on to Uli. Uli Baer, one of our moderators and co-organizers. Hi, Uli, is university professor at New York University, where he teaches literature and photography. His many books include What Snowflakes Get Right, Free Speech, Equality and Truth in the University, and with Amir, actually, Hannah Arendt, Zwischen den Disziplinen. And his most recent publication that he introduced and edited was Fiction of America, the Book of Firsts. Big shout out to that very, very thoughtful collection of firsts, so to speak. And Uli also hosts the Ideas podcast, Think About It, and has published editions of numerous classic books with warblers. Last but not least, Amir. Amir Eshel is, hi Amir, Edward Clark Crosset Professor of Humanities Studies and Professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature at Stanford University. His research focuses on contemporary literature and the arts as they touch on memory, history, politics, and ethics. He's the author, also among many other books and publications, Futurity, Contemporary Literature and the Quest for the Past, and Poetic Thinking Today. One more thing I wanted to mention for all of you who are here today, my personal algorithmic thinking tells me that you might be interested in our Festival Neue Literatur, which will take place from November 11th until the 14th. Mostly virtually, and we will shortly update our website. This is a festival that brings together German language authors and US authors in a transatlantic dialogue. And this year is curated by Alta Price and Tess Lewis. And please come join us for all the events, which I promise you will be fabulous. And now I will shut up and have a drink of water. Enjoy Sharon's reading, which will be our first step to this event. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.
So thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you to everyone who's listening and to my co-panelists. I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards. What I decided to do was to read a part of the novel which actually takes place in England. This was a particularly challenging part of the novel to write because I had to find a German language that would fit to 19th century England. Yeah, so those of you who understand German may be interested in the choices I made to try to get this sound. The part of the novel that I'm going to read this evening, just for about 5 minutes, comes right at the beginning. It's one of the sections that introduce the figure Ada, right in the first chapter. And the way that this figure is introduced is that I drop the readers right into it mid-sentence. So I'm going to read just the first introduction to this figure Ada in 19th century England, and then I'll give a little bit of context at the end of the reading.
Many thanks, Jon, for the reading. Many thanks, Sharon, for the wonderful reading. Many thanks to Juliane for the kind introductions. I have the great honor, pleasure to, first of all, express my gratitude, but also to present the first question so we get into our conversation. I wanted to ask you, Sharon, especially given this very rich, imagery we were now, aware of or made aware of with this scene. I wonder, especially in a novel, in such a rich in terms of thoughts and ideas, novel we have in front of us, I wonder if you could share with us perhaps the moment in which Ada in the plural, came to be, in which perhaps you saw Ada for the first time. And again, there's more than one Ada in the wonderful novel. If you could share with us some of the images you had in your mind as you sat down to write this magnificent novel.
Thank you. This is a great question. And the first Ada doesn't appear anymore, actually, in the novel. The first Ada was in this short story, which I'll hold up. That's the story for which I won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize, Herr Gröttrup setzt sich hin. And in this edition, it's got 2 English translations, which was the event that was mentioned earlier in the introduction last year. In the short story, the main event is a breakfast scene. There's a married couple, Herr und Frau Gröttrup, and it's you can tell by the way that the scene is written that these 2 individuals have been married for a long time, and they have a very set morning routine where every morning they have the same breakfast and they argue the same argument about how long it takes to boil an egg. And then the scene is disrupted because the egg decides to speak. Actually, you find out that it's the egg that decides that it doesn't want to be hard-boiled and refuses. And then you find out a bit more. And then right at the very end, we meet a figure called Ada or Ada, who is a cleaning lady. And there's not much said about her deliberately. We find out that she recently learned how to speak German and can speak fluent German now. We find out that she arrives so early at that house to do the cleaning that the man, Herr Gröttrup, doesn't even really know she exists. And then we find out that they meet in this short story, and he kind of is confronted with a person that he can't really grasp. He doesn't know who this person is, and kind of recognizes that she has some kind of knowledge, but can't really deal with that knowledge. He doesn't know how to all the words that are coming to my head are German. I want to say abfragen. He can't access the knowledge that this woman has. And the idea of the story is to say there are different forms of knowledge. So Herr Gröttrup is someone who's recognized as a scientist. He has this academic knowledge. I would say Frau Gröttrup has emotional knowledge. And it's alluded to in the short story that this Ada figure has some other sort of mystical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, if you will. She knows why she knows that the egg has a consciousness. She knows why the egg has refused to be hard-boiled. And if Herr Gröttrup was able to speak to her, he would also know, he would find out. So that's how the first Ada came about.
That's wonderful. And then moving from the first Ada then to the other Adas. So the Adas now in the novel. So share with us how they came to be.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So I wrote the short story, and I don't remember now how I came up with the name. But I do remember at some point researching the name and finding out that it exists in many different contexts. It's a Turkish name, it's a short form of a Polish name, it's a Nigerian name, it's a name of this woman who actually lived, Ada Lovelace, in the 19th century in Britain. And this fascinated me, that this name can't be attributed to one cultural context or one language. And that already told me a lot about what a possible figure called Ada could be. Then in the short story, I also obviously had this, what I call a being that had decided on that particular day to become an egg, right? So this being already speaks about how it's lived many different lives and many different times, always coming back to Earth as a different object. So it was a carpet, it was a crème brûlée, and I knew that to develop this short story into a whole novel-length project, I would have to give more space to these two figures, the being that was an egg and this Putzfrau, this cleaning lady, Ada. As the story developed, as I worked on the story, everything that had to do with the short story kind of fell away. So we don't meet this elderly couple anymore, unfortunately. The being is still there, but the being isn't an egg. The being is a broom, a door knocker, a room in a concentration camp, and in its last incarnation, it's a British passport at the time of Brexit. That was a real existential crisis for this being. And then we have the Ada figure who is living in different times. So she's living in 15th century West Africa. She's living in 19th century England, as I've said. She's living in Germany in a concentration camp at the end of the Second World War, 1945. And then she lives again, sort of bringing all different strands of the different Adas in 2019 in Berlin.
If I can pick up on this question, so the egg actually makes a little appearance in the novel at some point.
Yes.
Sort of for listeners who haven't read the book, and first of all, Jon, thank you also for giving such life to this voice, and Sharon, for actually, we're already hearing two different voices and two different people speaking in a scene where the woman is constantly thinking, am I going to bother to actually engage, or is
Yes.
not engaging the safer, and the kind of exasperation of having this guy keeping sort of lording it over her. There's another king, and I want to ask you something about this. So the novel is these kind of nesting stories, which reminded me of some really incredibly sort of epic novels like Cloud Atlas, David Mitchell, or Crossings by the Australian Alex Landragen, who gave Baudelaire's Black Lover, Jean Duval, a presence and gives her backstory and turns it into a character through time. And I love the fact that we go through history, but we're never quite sort of convinced that this period now stops and now we jump to another period. But then we discover there are deeper connections. And I want to ask you about one scene which I found incredibly moving, where a young enslaved person returns to the coast of Africa, Afonso, and you say something in the scene right here. So there's this guy, Senor Guilherme, who is a Portuguese guy who basically has enslaved this person who now returns to a place. And in this moment, he regains speech in a very tentative way and finds his voice. And when he arrives, he said the center of his world was really this person who owns him, who is his lord and master, who is the kind of dominating military figure. And he says he actually believed, he knew he deserved all the punishment. And es gab kein Versteck, weder physisch noch psychisch, there was no hiding place. The whole world was structured around this. And here your novel opens up a way. How do you open up this way of being completely sort of subsumed under someone's point of view? And I'll end my question in the middle of this book, and I'll show this to our listeners right here. So this is this beautiful novel. In the middle of the book, roughly, you have these 3 pages, and it says, ziemlich viel weiß. There's lots of white right here. And you say, dann eigentlich gar nichts mehr. Nothing beyond that. And that for all eternity. And then the book goes into a loop. And in this scene with this Afonso, you find a way to break out of this overwhelming trauma, which is not even trauma, it's just his reality, and you find another way out. And I think the whole novel is so amazing. With Ada also in 1850s London, she breaks out of this being dominated. So I would be really curious, when you have these characters, you must have, what did you feel toward a character like Afonso, who really, you in some way, I think you kind of activate a potential they have that history has not granted them?
That's a brilliant question. I'm loving this conversation.
Big in a way, but I kind of,
yeah.
It's not really big actually, but I really felt, I was so moved to see the scene of somebody who had no voice and who gains his voice, and the reader is taking in this very tentative process. He doesn't even trust the fact that he has this, and he recovers a language.
Yeah, that's so nice to hear you say that, because so far, mostly conversations about this novel have focused very, very much on the female perspective and the fact that it's about female suffering. And that is the main part, that's true. But with a figure like Afonso, I really tried to show lots of different things. And Afonso has a moment of speechlessness and then regaining his speech, which is something that actually I did experience myself. I had a very weird situation at the beginning of my life where I was born in the UK. I was born in London. And then when I was about 3 years old, we suddenly moved to Accra in Ghana. So I must have been fluently speaking English. I arrive in Accra, I forget how to speak English, and I start to learn how to speak Ga, which is the language that my parents both speak. We stayed in Accra, my brother, sister, and I, for 1.5 years. And my earliest memory now is returning to the UK, not being able to speak English, but speaking fluent Ga, and starting school and not being able to communicate with the people around me, and how disorientating it was to be suddenly in this new environment and dealing with snow and all these things. So I accessed that experience and remembering that disorientation when I was imagining what it must have been like for Afonso to suddenly be back in this scenario. What was it, 7 years later or something? I can't remember exactly how many. Hearing a language that he didn't understand anymore, but he recognized that it had something to do with him and what kind of emotions came up. And then there's a moment where he says, I don't want to speak any other language. I only want to speak this language. And even if I can only say 2 words for the rest of my life, I don't care. And that was another moment for me in the novel where, yes, he was enslaved and he did suffer trauma, but he makes a decision, even if it's like a limit. He's only got these 2 words, but he decides those are the 2 words I'm going to use. And it was very important for me to show these moments of power that people do take back. They claw back power, even when it seems that they have none.
To go back to Amir's question, there are different ways of not having language, as you said.
Yeah.
It's not just one way, and the other Adas, the one negotiates with her annoying, overbearing husband, the one who's imprisoned in a concentration camp has to remove herself constantly, and the one in Berlin today is also having to constantly think, can I afford to say this, or is it going to cost too much? Yeah. Maybe we go to Jon for a second as a translator, because Sharon's book is moving in several languages, but it doesn't settle on one language, as this is where you're really at home in a way, right? So I wonder how, Jon, how you did that, moving between these languages. And at the same time, I want to say, I mean, I said this to you right before, I was so moved and impressed, and also and there's a certain part, it sounds idiotic, who am I? But I'm really grateful this came out in German first. So this is actually going to enter into a space, and I love the novel is also claiming space. So good for you to publish.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Translate it into English, but that does matter a lot. So it's not a book that arrives yet again from an English-speaking world.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. I think what this novel does in the German language is, quite frankly, so novel. That it really is creating this new space within the language. And that's something which, needs a lot of work and consideration when you're translating it then into English, because the German language within this novel is doing a lot of things. Like, it is the main language of narration, but it is a very different German from chapter to chapter, from character to character. And that's something that I tried to be really conscious of in my translation, is that there are at least 4 primary narrative voices in the story, maybe even 5 or 6 if we look at all of the other moments, the moments that happen outside of time, the conversations between this being and God. And each of these different narrative voices really creates its own space in the German language. And so in translating this back into English, I tried to be really conscious of the ways in which that English appears. In some of the times I tried to, for example, never use contractions. And that's a very small narrative device, but just a way to distinguish between a sort of a more formal language and more of an internal dialogue. Some of the narrative voices happen largely in the character's head, in which case that language may be a lot more informal. It may be a lot more self-reflective. And I tried to always be really conscious of the ways in which each time period is acting on the language. And I think particularly in this passage, I tried to be, and I think throughout the story that takes place in 19th century England, I tried to really be careful of the vocabulary that I use, trying to use not only time appropriate, but also place appropriate. You know, if there's a British equivalent for a word, I might prioritize using that over the American word, even if it might make the reader stumble over it a little bit, because that lets you know we're in this space, we're in this time period, we're in this physical place. And that was really important to me in the translation process, because it's important that these different narrative voices have room to develop on their own, the way that they do in the German, in the English as well.
Thank you for that, John and Sharon. I want to go back to the conversation with Uli for a moment and ask you, Sharon, about the gendered, perspective, because Alfonso and Ada obviously, do not belong to the same gender. And to what extent, in a novel in which, very, imposing women figures are really central, to what extent is the gender question important or central for you as you're imagining and then creating these characters and allowing us to follow the way they evolve over time?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, which I go over and over again in my mind, because I definitely wanted to write, I once made a joke, which was only half a joke actually, which was, I'm gonna write, all my creative writing is gonna have the main character as a Black woman until I've caught up with all the white men. So I'm not gonna manage that, right? But I did want to write, it was true that I did want to write a Black female character as the main character, just because I felt like there just aren't that many of them in German language literature that are complex characters. Maybe they have their own contradictory traits and such, but still are characters that we can take seriously, that we can follow their trajectory. I wanted to do that. However, it was also important to me to develop characters that, yes, because they're living in their contexts, they are experiencing sexism, or they are experiencing racism, but that wasn't the whole story. They were also doing other things. Like, so for example, the figure Ada Lovelace is a good example of a woman who is, as we have just experienced, she was dealing with being belittled by a man in her life. And yet she was also, she was clever enough to be able to actually belittle him back, and also she's a figure who actually has a great amount of class privilege over her servant, Lizzie. And we examine the relationship between Lady Ada and Lizzie, and we see that Lady Ada herself also kind of exerts a kind of violence onto Lizzie. That I describe a particular joke that Ada makes, which shows her ignorance about the traumatic experiences that Lizzie has had. And the reason I did that was to say, yes, of course, in our different identities, we do experience marginalization, but we also do have dominance and privilege within us. It's a complicated mixture. It's not one or the other. So I then also have figures who are male, who also have different combinations of privilege and marginalization. But the main focus was this figure, Adas Raum is the title of the story, because we're following the main character, Ada or Ada. And one of my good friends who moderated the book premiere, Professor Dr. Maisha Aouma, said, this isn't Frauenliteratur, it's not women's literature, it's not a book about women, it's a book that takes women's lives seriously. And I like that description. I think that's what I try to do.
I also, to connect to this, I mean, the novel grew out of concerns with sort of domestic life and sort of what there's actually, that life has this incredible complexity. So, you know, one of the great paradigms of novels is Jane Austen, who manages to create entire worlds out of 22 people total, 4 of whom matter, and that's it. But an entire world arises, and partly that's because as a woman, she had no other place to find the world. And then the novel also has this kind of epic dimension of capturing all of history. And I love how in the book you go between the very domestic, the confined, literally confined to a few square meters, and the woman Ada in the concentration camp, she walks back and forth, hitting really back and forth, this kind of confinement. And then Ada in Berlin today trying to find a room where she can actually just live. So that, but then the novel also zooms out and goes to these kind of very big sort of questions that are also roiling places all over the world right now, of restitution, of reparation, of actually acknowledging the histories of oppression. So I really liked how you kind of inserted these very domestic concerns into these very large debates, and you managed, for me at least, to sort of get us to the difficulty of that these questions can't be easily resolved with one political act or one act of financial restitution. And there's a kind of question of a restitution of an object in the novel, and nobody really accepts any answer. Nobody really says, oh, this can be resolved in this way. And it's kind of interesting because you sort of think, oh, someone could just say, okay, we'll do it, but we're done. And you are sort of saying, this object carries a history that won't be done, no matter what is done, no matter what is given back to somebody. I really loved that part. And I wonder if you could say a little bit, because you're also an activist and you are participating very much in sort of the Berlin scene, sort of these other questions that are not only in Germany right now, but they're in the United States, they're in France, they're in Belgium, they're in many countries. They take place in Accra, they take place in Lagos.
Yeah, for sure.
So could you say something about this kind of connection from Amir's question maybe to the kind of...
Happily, yes. Yes, and I like that you highlight that I've tried to weave the smaller stories, the domestic stories, with this larger context, because one of the things I tried to do was to experiment with the idea of how would history be written if it was written by people who are not the big winners, you know, who did not have the big armies and conquer places, but were just sitting on the coast and fishing, you know, frying lots of fish. What would they have recorded for us and handed down? What stories would we be reading now? And another thing that I tried to do with this novel is to think a lot about these boundaries or these borders that we have. We have national boundaries, and they seem to be like neatly contained. You have your languages all neatly boxed up. You have your nations boxed up, you have your history boxed up, you know. And sometimes when you go to a museum and you see one part, that's the European history section, and then you see another part, that's the African history section, and they don't combine. And I wanted to think more about how these things are actually much more interwoven than we are used to discussing. And that's what the Berlin section of the novel is trying to do. The Berlin section of the novel is trying to say, yeah, Ghana is there, England is there, Germany is there, but actually this figure has connected all three. And what you mentioned, this restitution of an object that comes up in the novel, this is a bracelet, a golden pearl bracelet that we first see in the 15th century. It's a fertility bracelet that is stolen by colonialists. It turns up again in 19th century England as a family heirloom, and it's never spoken about within this family where the bracelet actually comes from. It's assumed that it belongs to this British family and has always been there, which is something like how, you know, British people feel about all sorts of things that are displayed in the British Museum. It's always been here, it belongs to us, right? And then you have the scene in Germany, 1945, where when the third Ada figure arrives in the concentration camp, she has everything taken away from her. She mentions, they also took away my mother's bracelet. And that's a hint that we know, okay, so this bracelet traveled from England to Germany and has now been taken away again. We then come across the bracelet in 2019, and we never see it in real life in the modern section. It's just a picture in a catalogue of an exhibition. And the question arises, how does a bracelet that clearly comes from West Africa, 15th century, end up being displayed in Berlin? And this is an allusion to, for example, the Benin bronzes, which are highly being discussed at the moment. The Benin bronzes, how did they end up in the Humboldt Forum? They were looted literally from an area of Africa, which is now known as Nigeria. They were stolen, they were taken to England, British Museum, they were sold. Somebody in Germany bought a couple and then thought it would be a good idea to display them. And now we have this controversy today about how are these bronzes going to be returned? Who are they going to be returned to? Who are we negotiating with about the bronzes? Because it was clearly not the Nigerian government. The Nigerian government was created when, 1960 or something, but the bronzes were taken in the 18th century. They didn't belong in the capital, the present capital. They belonged in another area. So these are very complicated questions. And I deliberately decided not to put a fake, sugary, happy end on that story. At the end of my novel, the bracelet is still in the museum, and the question is, who does this bracelet belong to? It certainly doesn't belong to the Germans, and at some point they will be returned. There is hope that they will be returned to Africans, but it's not clear when or how that will happen.
I want to give a shout out to my colleague Amir Eshel here, who has a book, and in Amir's book, Poetic Thinking Today, he sort of says, art can sometimes create the space where these questions can be kind of maintained without resolving them. And I love in your book when one of the characters says, I'm certainly not going to pay a museum to see things that belong to me. And in that question is so much which cannot be resolved. And even the most well-intentioned, and you have this going through the novel, and I would be curious how John translated it in doing good. The opposite of doing good is doing something with good intentions.
Yeah.
So that the good intention, put in a museum, it's going to be for everybody. And this woman says, I'm not going to pay to see what belongs to me. So, and Amir sort of said that art is a space where you can hold on to these questions, which we have to resolve in some place in the politics or law or finance, but they're not resolved with this at all. So I kind of like that you kept that open. And maybe we'll go to John. How did you translate this? I think something like good, the opposite of good is well-intended. It's so German. It makes, as a German, I'm like, oh yes, exactly. I know what you mean.
Yeah, I'm just looking through my translation right now to see. So the first time that it appears in the story is when the 21st century Ada is arriving in Germany, and she's waiting in line to go through customs, and an elderly German couple tells her to go to the line for non-EU citizens, just assuming by appearance that she's not traveling with a British passport. And so she waits for a long time, and then she arrives at the gate, and not at the gate, but at immigrations, and the customs officer says, das Gegenteil von gut ist gut gemeint. And in the text, actually leave it in the German and then put like a dash and say, good intentions aren't the same as good results. So the first time that it appears in the story, I actually leave the German and provide a translation. When it reoccurs as sort of like a mantra that it repeats to herself, then I only use the English translation.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I mean, it's I think the ability of great literature to ask questions, or to encourage us to ask questions, rather than give us all the answers, or perform a sermon or be a sermon. That's really beautiful. I wonder, Sharon, if you could talk a little bit about your experience of writing in German. How does it feel for you? What are your thoughts about it? It has become somewhat of a phenomenon also, in other places around the world. I'm thinking about Jhumpa Lahiri, for example, learning Italian, now writing in Italian. So if you could share with us a little bit about your experience, writing in German.
Yeah, happily. it was a big challenge. German is not a very easy language, I find. What I like to do when I started off being a creative writer in English, and what I really enjoy doing is playing around and writing things that are ambiguous, actually, and leaving the reader to decide. The reader can make up their own mind how they want to interpret something. And I found German mostly a very, very clear language. Like, most words have this one meaning, they're very clear, and it's difficult to stretch them to mean something else. At least that was my feeling when I write something in English. It kind of has associations straight away. The only exception, actually, is the title of my novel. Adas Raum has more possibility for interpretation than I think the English word does. Raum can also be interpreted or translated as room or space. So yeah, maybe Jon, you'd like to share why you chose realm at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I thought really the same thing. Raum can mean space, can mean room, like a physical room, like the room in the novel. And I think in some ways, realm retains this, like it can be something sort of spatial, but it can also be something more specific, like a country can be a realm. I chose it on the one hand because it retained something of the sound of the original, right? It came the closest to sounding like Raum. But also I think that to say just room doesn't do justice to the multiple spheres in which, you know, Ada appear in the story. And I thought that would be a little bit too limiting. Although I do, on the other hand, like sort of the nod at something like, you know, a room of one's own. Which is obviously something which has been, you know, mentioned a few times in interpretations of your novel. On the other hand, something like space, I think just doesn't sound nice, doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
And for me, Rome seemed to be something of a compromise. I have to also confess it was not my invention at all, it's my partner's. And we were reading through all of these translations and she said, well, Rome sounds nice. Yes, yeah, Rome does
Shout
sound
out
nice.
To the partners in the background. Yeah.
So it was not a completely individual decision on my part.
I'd like to also mention that writing in German, I feel like I can't quite grasp what I'm actually doing with this language. Like with English, I would say I've got a 99.999% understanding that if I use this word with this context, with this imagery, it's going to have this effect on this audience. And with German, because I wasn't socialized here, I haven't, you know, my educational background is a British one, not a German one, especially considering that I write about a concentration camp and a person in a concentration camp. That was something where it isn't even just a language issue, but it's a sensitivity issue about my position and can I actually take on a voice of somebody who's imprisoned in a concentration camp, all these things. I've said in the past, writing in German feels a little bit like using a smartphone wearing gloves, you know, like I'm just trying to hit the right tone, hit the right spot. And I think all that work that went into trying to get the German, I mean, I write in German, and then of course I have people who correct it, who edit, who discuss my ideas with me and help me to shape it. So this is also a collaborative effort, right, my novel. But what I also wanted to really make clear this evening was simply because I can speak English, it doesn't mean I can translate this book. I really want to say that because it's often the case that people will say to me, okay, so when's the book coming out? You're going to translate it yourself? And I'm like, no way. This was such a hard book to wrest from wherever I took it from and force it onto paper in the German language. I'm not interested in doing that work again in English because it's just not the same as, I don't know, putting it into Google Translate and it will spit something out. There is an interpretation that takes place. And I don't want to interpret my own work. I'm happy for somebody else to say, oh, this is what I associate with that word, or this is what I associate with that image. So I was super grateful actually that, Jon, you agreed to take this on, because I can really imagine that the idea of translating a work into English where the author speaks English as their first language must have been horrible, actually. That thought.
It was very intimidating, yeah. I think, in general, translating for living German authors, the assumption is generally that they also speak English to some degree. I mean, English is very much a second language in Germany, but it's a different thing entirely to translate for someone whose first language is English. Or I guess in your case, 1.5 second language.
Yeah, I would say
in
now
either
first,
case,
yeah.
it's a different thing. So on the one hand, it's nice because I feel like, I mean, we've already seen we bounce ideas off of each other, and I can, ask you if you approve of a particular translation or what do you think about this particular word. But at the end of the day, it's also a much more nerve-wracking experience for me to present you with a larger piece and say, okay, what do you think of what I did with this scene? Because you're going to have your whole own set of interpretations and expectations around that. In a way, I think that someone who's approaching English as, second or third or fourth language is not going to. On the other hand, the feedback can be much more constructive. So, it's a give and take.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a different experience.
Shared creative experience. I mean, something emerges together, which is beautiful, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it feels very much like a collaboration. And I think that's a really neat experience to have from a translator's perspective, working on, translating literature. It should feel in some way like a collaboration. And I think this gives a whole new level of meaning to that.
There's 2 questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to summarize. One is kind of about your writing process. Are there things you could name maybe? And I'm sure there are translators and writers in the audience. What has helped or hindered you during the writing process? So I always love to hear that. So what do you do before you sit down with your pencil or something? Like a very concrete thing. And the other one is the storyline of a same-sex couple in the 15th century. What moved you to do this? Those are 2 questions in the Q&A.
I'd like to answer them in reverse order. This is the same-sex couple was an important one to me. Some people might know that at the moment in Ghana, there is a lot of persecution of LGBTQI people, and they're trying to enact laws which are, anyway, very exasperating. And I don't remember when I found out about that and how that coincides with the writing process. I don't remember that. I don't think that I was writing in response to that. I think it was more that I had a general feel for the fact that, the history of African countries has been, for want of a better word, whitewashed, and many people who think about African histories and are accessing them from a Western perspective, I mean, often the history begins with the enslavement of African people. It's a lot about patriarchy, a lot about, Christianity and missionaries and so on. And when I was researching for the novel, I knew that I wanted to start the novel earlier. I wanted it to begin before colonization, just to say, look, there were people alive and kicking before Europeans arrived on the coast, and they were doing, they were having arguments with each other. They were having traumatic events like losing babies in childbirth, but they loved each other, they supported each other. These were real communities. And in those communities, there were people who took on different roles from a gender perspective. So there were matrilineal communities or matriarchal communities, and there were communities where people took on specific roles, and it wasn't really attached to a gender. Or if it was attached to a gender, say there was a man and woman who were married, and the man had all the land. If the man died, it could be that a woman would step in and marry the woman and then continue look after it. It was about the work that needed to be done, and it wasn't so, the gender roles weren't so fixed back then as I understand it. And that's something I just thought, I want that to be in the novel. It was also important to me because I myself identify as a cis heterosexual woman, which means I'm comfortable with the gender I was assigned with at birth, and I'm romantically interested in cis men or men. And I felt like a lot of literature, German language literature, like I said, which is typically focused on white men, is also typically focused on straight people. And I don't want to go along with that. As far as I can, I wanted to introduce characters in my novel who were disabled. I wanted to introduce characters in my novel who are in same-sex relationships. I also thought a bit about gender identities. It's not so clear. I think people who would who have this more present in their everyday lives might recognize it in the storyline, but it's not underlined and starred and accessible for people who are not so into these themes. But that was something I just felt like I want my novels to be areas or experiences for people who will not be re-traumatized. They will not experience marginalization again. As far as I can, I want it to be an inclusive storytelling event, if you will. And I want to say, I know that these people exist in my communities, and as far as I can, I want them to be part of my narratives, even if they're not the main character. I don't believe it's my role to write from the first person perspective of a lesbian woman, but I want these people to be part of my figures community. So that's why I chose to do that. Then to go back to the other question, which was my writing experience, that's a harder question, which is why I put it second. But I think I'm a pragmatic writer. I know it's no secret that I live with children. That means I can't follow my artistic flow as much as I would like to. If I didn't live with children, I would wake up much later in the day. I'd probably wake up about, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the afternoon and write until 3 o'clock in the morning. That would be my rhythm. But I'm forced to get out of bed to take people to school and things like that. So what I tend to do is I write around emotions. Sometimes I have an impulse to write something which describes something that made me particularly angry. I don't write the actual thing that made me angry, but I write what the emotion did with me. Or writing about loss, or writing about, I remember when I was writing the novel, there was an impulse at some point to write about something that I was trying to forget, an experience I had which wasn't nice, and I didn't want to think about it. And the way that I tried to repress this memory, but it kept coming back, that kind of work that I was doing, I wrote about that, and that became part of the novel. And I kind of write in bits and pieces, which is, you can see the way the novel is constructed is kind of lots of things that are then put together in a narrative whole. So I tend to write quite pragmatically when I can find a moment, or when I have a good, a strong impulse, something that's moving me in a particular way, and I write about that. And then much later, I rewrite, I rework things, I read things over again and see what they've done to me, whether I still understand it, whether I still connect with it emotionally. And I write sort of like that incrementally.
I really love your answer, and somehow the novel feels that these characters are very charged from their own places. So Lizzie and her brother are very real, and the fishmonger. So everybody comes from their own place. And I can, when you're talking now, I can get a little bit of a sense. It's coming from you tapping into an emotion, but you don't see on the page that this is the emotion you're talking about. You actually, the story brings you into a space that is really charged, but very sensitive to these people's different, they all have their own centers of the universe. I really love the way sort of some characters really stay with you, and you know they're motivated by something very different from the person next to them. So Lizzie and her brother, who are this couple, sort of the servant girl in London, but then she's actually taking care of her little brother, and they fled from Ireland, and there's something, they're all motivated from another place, although they're so close and you could so easily collapse them. So I really, what you just said made sense to me, kind of you hear that, and yet it's all very subtle. There's nothing to me that's, I kind of wanted every story to stay there, and then also to say what's going to happen in another story now. I was just like, oh my God, I'm so excited. I'm back here now. It's so gripping.
Yes, I've heard that often. And I have two answers to that. The first answer, I guess, is sorry. That's my storytelling style, you know, that I work with cliffhangers and leaving some things open for the reader to fill in themselves. And I guess that's not for everyone. But the second thing is, what I also try to do with Adas Raum is to link the stories through time. So Afonso is actually linked to Alfie, Lizzie's brother, who's then linked to Afonso later, Alphonse. And these things, I try to tell the story through these characters that live many different times, many different lives, in many different contexts, and they all come together somehow in the end. So it's not an easy read in the sense that, oh yeah, I see it all straight away, but it wasn't intended to be easy. It was intended to be an emotional experience. Yeah.
I think it also, Sharon, to be about paying attention, about the ability of literature to pay attention and to, I mean, I hate the phrase or you know, saying it, to teach us how to pay attention. There's something about the novel which really speaks to it, from character to detail to plot line. It's really striking, as Uli was putting it. I see one question, you know, in the Q&A that could be interesting in this regard, and this is about Virginia Woolf's Orlando. If Orlando may have played a role as inspiration, or if the work of Virginia Woolf is for you an inspiration, if you could share with us a little bit about sources of inspiration.
Sure, I can do that. So unfortunately, no, I never read Orlando. And while I was working on the novel, my editor, Hans-Jürgen Balmes, wonderful, very, very patient guy, he said to me, oh, this reminds me a lot of Orlando. And so I do know, I have it on my radar, so to speak, that this book is something that I would like to dip into and find out more about. A Room of My Own, A Room of One's Own is the much more obvious link for me. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's a talk, isn't it? And I found it really striking how this woman, I mean, she reminded me a lot of Ada Lovelace, or the figure of Ada, where she was like, yeah, this is what I'm experiencing, and these are demands I have, and this is what I would need if I were to move forward. And so that I wanted to make that very clear, that link. There are a lot of little nods that I made every now and then in the novel to different authors, just to keep the readers who love literature going.
You clearly have what Virginia Woolf has, that she is so funny when she's biting sometimes, because you can sort of see the exasperation of having to explain to these annoying men around her things that are perfectly obvious, but then sometimes in your book there are very funny moments in the middle of these very difficult things. So I think the humor is definitely comes out of Woolf. I'm going to give John one more chance, and I have one question for you, Sharon, which is a very metaphysical, absurd question. So these people are linked. So you said Afonso is Alfie, is Alphonse, he sort of appears. Ada appears in 1459, in 1849, in 1945, in 2018. Do you believe that people actually are linked in any way, that actually there's something in the world that links us, that we live through time? This is not a question you have to answer at all, but I sometimes teach the Tibetan Book of the Dead or things, or really different way of thinking of history and time, not just it's done, we did something, it has its effect in the world, but that there are connections which tap into some kind of ghostly. So I'm just curious whether you ever have a sense we are not just inhabited by ourselves, but there's something in us. I'm just curious whether you
yeah. No, I don't have I don't have the answer to this question. Like, now you know what Sharon thinks, but this book was definitely something like a thought experiment on what if, and you might remember the scene I describe an area, and in tree it's called Asamando. In English it would be, in German it's Jenseits. in English, it would be beyond, the beyond place. I don't know, the place where we go when we die, we all return to when we die, and it's the place where we are before we're born. And I describe this place, and I use a really weird metaphor of a sausage making machine. Maybe you remember that. The sausage making machine was my attempt to say, look, these weird identities and, you know, this is a man and this is a woman, this is all it's artificial. It's something that's created. It's not, we're not born this way. We're kind of, I think Simone de Beauvoir said, we're not born as women, we're made to be women. And this is something I tried to display with the novel. We have this sausage machine situation where everyone's there as this mass and we're all there together, we're all in it together. And then at some point, at some arbitrary point, we're squeezed through this machine and we're separated at some random spot. And then where we're separated, the personalities are separated and the input is separated and our contradictory thoughts are separated. And then we become individuals and then we're sent onto this earth and we live our experiences and then we return at some point to this place and start again. That's why there's a figure of eternity, not because it's an endless, John, what word did you use for Schleife again?
I used orbit.
Orbit, yeah. It's not an endless orbit. I'm trying to describe where it just goes round and round, but it's, each time we go through it, we learn a little bit more, we gain a little bit more experience, we're able to transform. So for example, as a person who's active in movements against racism and sexism and for feminism, I don't think that the work I'm doing is going to bear fruit tomorrow or next month. It's not going to be like, sexism will be over if I do these 3 things today. It's more a question of, how can we keep on moving the processes along? How can we learn from what's happened in the past to keep on working on transforming the future? And that's more of the idea. So these identities, these individuals are not so cut off. The people who lived before me are not so far away, actually. I can still access them through their literature or their books or their oral histories. Yeah, I don't even know if that answered your question, but I kind of wanted to think about what if it were possible that we all were more connected than we appear to be.
That's a beautiful thought.
Thank you.
Sharon, I think
that's a great answer. Thank you. And John,
through language, I think, just kind of really responding to what you said. I mean, we're connected to them through language.
Yes.
Language we heard and our parents heard and gave to us. So. And language is your medium after all, and our medium, sitting in this room. So that's a wonderful way to bring it all together.
John,
we interrupted you.
Yes. When is the book going to be? Are you done with it at this moment? Are you calling Sharon and texting her every 5 minutes and saying, "Wait, I'm doing this. Is this okay with you?" Does she sort of sign off on things? Or where are you in the process right now?
Yes and no. So I am. Let me actually take a look here. I am on page 240 right now in the novel in terms of my translation. So I'm more than 2/3, just about 3/4 of the way finished with the translation, but that doesn't mean, let's say I'm finished with the translation draft. So of those pages, I think Sharon's probably read about 25 or so, maybe 30. And I don't want this to become like a process of me burdening Sharon constantly and having her, double and triple and quadruple check what I've done. But it was important for me early on in the process that I get a lot of feedback on the first chapters, because those are the moments when I'm trying myself to establish the voices in English and the different narrative styles. And so I have, various phases in which I'm translating onward in the text, or in which I'm going back and reading and rereading or comparing my translation with the original. And that's an ongoing process. So I would say of those 250 odd pages that I've translated, Probably I feel real comfortable with about half of it. And the other half, I have little notes to myself, little things that are marked, things that I'll go over with other people to see what they think about what I've said. And then ultimately, a few sections where I think I need Sharon's feedback directly. I mean, I appreciate her feedback always, but at the same time, I don't want it to be a process of her rewriting this book. So it is definitely a give and take. And I think I send her voice messages fairly regularly, and we correspond back and forth on particular moments. But for the most part, I'm trying to move through it as quickly as possible to give myself the maximum amount of time to do review. I believe I'm supposed to turn in my finished manuscript, or at least a close to finished manuscript at the end of the year. So on December 31st. And that will give about approximately a year of time for it to be re-edited, formatted, and it should be published either at the end of 2022 or the very beginning of 2023.
Amir, should we conclude? Maybe, first of all, we want to thank the attendees, the panelists. We want to thank Juliana and Zara, and maybe Sharon. People do always want to know, what are you going to be incarnated as next? You've been an egg, a door knocker, a broom, a room. So what can we look forward to next?
I don't want to be typecast. I'm moving away from the objects now.
That's a big range for the entire universe is open. You've opened up a possibility for you, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to break free of the speaking objects. So I'm looking for a new thing now. And you'll watch this space. I'll come up with something new.
we can't wait. We're totally thrilled. And I'm just going to say, before Juliana comes in, buy this book and send it to your friends. And Jon, thank you so much for giving it to English-speaking readers and returning something to another language.
And
thank you.
Maybe, Uli, this is a good place to note that on Audible, you can actually listen to Sharon reading the book. And this is an absolutely magnificent experience. So shout out also for the Audible version, because it's absolutely gorgeous.
Let me add to the thanks. Thank you so much to all four of you for this very energetic, thoughtful, inspiring conversation. And it reminded me why this event format, these literary conversations with authors and translators, are my favorite event format, not only virtually, but also in person. And I hope we will soon be able to resume it in person, because that even adds a richer dimension. But on the other hand, we are delighted to reach our friends all over the world with these virtual conversations. So we celebrate the interconnectedness of all these beautifully literary minded people in the world, and are glad that books like Sharon's and translations like Jon's and moderations like Uli's and Amir create a place where we can all share these really intriguing thoughts and celebrate the connectedness, the community, and the transgenerational effects of our shared history, and turn it into something good. This sounds incredibly pathetic, but I had to say it. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to doing an event with Sharon in the not too distant future and discussing more incarnations of voices in objects, or not, who knows. But take good care. Wish you a wonderful, long, at least here in the US, long weekend, since we're celebrating Indigenous People Day on Monday, and take good care of yourselves wherever you are. Thank you, everybody. Gute Nacht. Tschüssi. Bye-bye.